Hello everybody and welcome back to Natalie Reads. My name is Natalie and welcome to my mid-year book freakout tag. So this is the tag that is very popular on BookTube around the halfway point of the year that is reflecting on your reading so far this year and looking forward into what you want to read for the rest of the year. So there's a list of questions in this tag and I will leave them in the description box down below so that you can see them if you want to do it yourself. But besides that, I think we're just going to jump right in. So the first question is, what is the best book you've read so far? And for this question, I'm going to have to go for something that is more of a series that's collectively been the best thing I've read so far, not necessarily one book that I can pick out and say, this has been the best thing, and that is One Piece. I have absolutely fell in love with One Piece this year. Technically, I started it last year, but I read like 7 volumes. I was reading them very sporadically. I wasn't reading them quickly and like the way you're supposed to, but this year, especially recently, I have just fallen so deeply in love with One Piece. As I get further in the story, the characters are just even more well developed and I care for them so much now as I'm almost on volume 50. The world building in the series is immaculate and Oda never ceases to impress me with these amazing islands that he's able to come up with and the crazy cool concepts that are living in his brain. The crew members just amaze me, and seeing how they all interact with each other and the relationships they have built thus far is absolutely amazing. I care so much about these characters. It's absolutely amazing. I remember in the last section that I read, I almost cried because of something a ship did. A ship. If that doesn't prove how much this series has just embedded itself in my heart, I don't know what else does, and this series has just absolutely been the best thing I've read this year. The next question is the best sequel you've read all year, and for that I'm gonna say Stolen Heir by Sophie Lark. So this is the second book in the Brutal Birthright series, and I actually read the first 3 books in this series this year. However, Stolen Heir is the second book. And I think this is the best sequel this year because, I mean, it's not necessarily a direct sequel, it's more of a companion novel where we're set in the same world as in the first book, but it still was absolutely amazing. This one was my favorite one in this series so far. I liked the first book, I forget its name, it was good, it just wasn't my favorite thing, but Stolen Heir really captivated me and I was so invested in the romance. In this book, we're following Nessa, who is the youngest daughter in this like mafia family in Chicago. And she actually is kidnapped by Mikolai, who is part of the Polish mafia because he is getting revenge on Nessa's family, I think, because they killed his parents. I think that's like the basic premise. And then eventually Nessa and Mikolai end up falling in love. And I don't know, I really like this book. It was a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And I thought seeing kind of both sides, Nessa and Mikolai, both of them are very well developed characters that, you know, you grow to care for a lot. And I think kind of seeing, especially in Mikolai, the anger he had towards Nessa and her family in general, as it kind of disintegrates throughout the book and you see him just caring about her more and more and more to where he decides, screw it, I don't care about my revenge anymore. I just want her and I just want her to be safe. Nessa grows a lot throughout the book. At the beginning of the book, she's a more timid girl, a little bit shy, but she truly blossoms and is able to make the best out of her situation. I truly believed the romance in this book between the two of them, just watching them grow and care for each other. It was so well developed and yeah, I really enjoyed this book. It was definitely the best sequel I've read this year. Next is new releases you want to read but haven't yet. And I actually have 2 books for this question. So first up, I want to read Justice of Kings by Richard Swan because I haven't heard necessarily great things about this book since its release, but the premise is really interesting, so I want to give it a shot. So in this book, we're following this guy who's the king's justice. He goes around the land doing the king's will, and his kind of assistant that goes along with him, and as they're going along doing their thing, they discover like a conspiracy plot or whatever and have to figure out what to do with it, I think. Now, I have not heard a lot of great things about this book because people, I think, went into this and they got something that they weren't expecting. I think people didn't really expect the guy's assistant to play as much of a role as she does. I think she's a pretty large part of the plot. And also the plot may have been slightly different from what people were expecting. So I don't know. I'm hoping if I go in with altered expectations and a little bit lower expectations, I'll still end up loving this book. But it just intrigues me so much that I want to give it a shot. And the other book that I want to read, that I actually pre-ordered because it's a sequel to one of my favorite books, got 300 pages in, and then stopped reading is House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. So if I had actually finished this, you know, it may have ended up getting best sequel, but I haven't. Just the situations when I was reading this book just weren't great. There was some stressful family stuff going on, and so I decided to just put it down, and I was gonna come back to it later, but that hasn't happened yet. So I think I need to restart this book before I can finish it, but I still really want to read this book. I love this series, Crescent City. I fell in love with the first book. I also reread the first book this year so I could read this book, so I definitely want to get to this one sooner rather than later. So in Crescent City, we follow Bryce, who at the beginning of the story is a party girl. She's in college. She's living her best life with her best friend, and then one night, something truly devastating happens that changes Bryce's life forever. And we fast forward 2 or so years, and Bryce ends up getting recruited to investigate a string of murders that are happening around the city, and she gets teamed up with Hunt, who is a fallen angel, and he's assigned as her bodyguard. And it's following not only her investigating these murders, but also her romance with Hunt. So Crescent City not only is great in terms of the plot, but also in terms of the romance, because Bryce and Hunt are just amazing characters. There's also a lot of heavy themes like grief in the first book, so definitely do be wary of that before going into it. But yeah, I really need to read the sequel. I will say I was a bit thrown off at the beginning of this because first there's like a prologue that has nothing to do with anything we've learned so far. And then there's been like a time jump in between the first and second books that I wasn't expecting. So I need to start this book over so I can get back into it and absolutely love it, and I really would love to do that soon. So the next question is your most anticipated release for the rest of the year, and for me that's going to be Ruby Fever by Ilona Andrews, which is the 6th book in the Hidden Legacy series and the 3rd book in Catalina's story. So this is also going to be the finale in Catalina's stories, and then I believe we're getting another one of her sisters. I think we're getting at least 3 trilogies in this world, I believe. So this is a finale to a series that I absolutely love. I read this whole series up until this point last year, and then I reread it this year. So I'm so excited for Ruby Fever. I've been waiting for it so long. I think this book was supposed to come out last year, but then it got delayed to August of this year, so I'm hoping that it doesn't get delayed again. So describing the series is kind of hard, but in the first book, in the first series, we're following Nevada Baylor, who has like powers, but like lots of people in this world have powers. She can tell truth from lie, I think, and that makes her a very powerful and very wanted person. However, she keeps her powers secret, and she runs a PI agency, and she gets recruited to investigate this guy who has stolen artifacts and now is missing, and his family wants her to find him. And along the way she meets up with Mad Rogan, who is a ex-military, very powerful man, and they work together to find this man. Of course they fall in love. So that was the first 3 books. The second 3 books are following Catalina's sister and kind of an adjacent but also connected plot line to that. This book is going to be the finale to that series, and I am so excited for the series because I love it. Not only is the romance great, but the family dynamics are amazing, and then also the plot is pretty interesting, so I'm so excited for this book, which hopefully is coming out in August. Next is Biggest Surprise, and that's got to be Persuasion by Jane Austen. So I knew I would like this book going into it, but I didn't know I would love it. I hadn't heard as much about Persuasion as a bunch of the other Austen novels I'd read. Prior to this, I'd read Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Sense and Sensibility, and I'd heard pretty good things about most of those. Persuasion, I hadn't really heard anyone mention. I was just looking for the next Austen to read, saw my mother had this on her shelf, and I picked it up. Since picking this up, I have actually found out that Persuasion is my mom's favorite Austen book, so maybe if I had known that going into it, I wouldn't be so surprised about how much I love this book. But I absolutely adored this book. So in this book, we're following Anne, and 8 years prior to the start of the story, Anne had a romance with this guy, Captain Wentworth, and they were engaged. But Anne's family and her best friend convinced her not to marry Captain Wentworth because he was of lower status than them. He was a sailor, he did not have much money to his name, but he was very convinced that he was going to grow in ranks, he was going to rise to the Navy, he was going to become prosperous. But Anne's family said, no, Anne, we're better than him, don't marry her. Anne didn't really want to go along with her family, but she decided they're my family, they know what's best, and she broke off the engagement. However, 8 years later, Anne's family is doing horribly financially. Her father and her sister have mismanaged it so bad. They're in a bad situation, and then Anne and Captain Wentworth are reunited. They meet each other again, and let's just say he is quite successful. And this leads Anne to realizing she made a mistake. She's always kind of known she made a mistake, but seeing him again just confirmed to her, I shouldn't have broken off that engagement. I still love him. I've always loved him. But the problem is he seems to be flirting with other girls. He seems to be over Anne and not caring about her anymore. This book is so good. So Anne is a really interesting character to follow. Just seeing her regret and then seeing her just like be like, oh my god, I love him. He doesn't love me, but I still love him. I'm an idiot. It's so charming. And then just seeing like the romance between the two of them, kind of trying to figure out if he still has feelings for her. Okay, maybe he does. Oh, he's running with another girl. Maybe he doesn't. Just like the fact that like at the beginning of the book he barely like talks to her or like acknowledges her. This book has a scene that just towards the end of it that just like makes my knees weak. It's so good. And like while the romance in this book is great, also the relationships, seeing Anne and how she interacts with everyone else. And let's just say there were some pretty humorous characters in this book that made this book so much fun to read, and I was just so surprised as to how much I loved this. I think this is actually my second favorite Austen behind Pride and Prejudice, so it was definitely surprising that I loved it this much. Next question is new favorite author, and for that I absolutely have to go with Oda, who wrote One Piece. I've already talked at length about how I fell in love with this series, and the same goes from this author. I don't know if he's written other things, but I know his focus has primarily been on One Piece, so I don't really know if there would be other things for me to read of him. I love his work. It's so good, and I've absolutely fallen in love with One Piece, so kind of hard for him not to be a favorite author if I've literally read 50 volumes, over 300 chapters of his work, and not consider him a favorite author. The next question is newest fictional crush, and I don't have one, which is kind of weird because I love romance books, but I don't know, I just don't really have a fictional crush this year, which is interesting. I mean, there've certainly been men in romance books that I like, but none that have really stood out to me, so I don't have an answer for that question. So the next question is book that made you cry, and no book has made me cry this year, but I will give you the book that made me the most emotional, and that is Dreamland by Sarah Dessen. I can't even describe this book. This book deals with some very, very, very hard topics, so definitely look it up if you need trigger warnings. But in this book, we're following our main character, I forget her name, in a relationship she gets into, and I'll just leave it at that. So yeah, the emotions and the things that happen in this book are so heartbreaking, and they're so sad to read about, and just seeing everything that happens to our main character and just how she deals with everything, it's really hard to read, and being in her head and experiencing these things with her are extremely hard. I can't really go into specifics about what makes this book so sad and so emotional, but there definitely are things in this book that are hard to read. I mean, a bunch of Sarah Dessen books do have harder topics to read about, so this one was just especially touching. And it was a reread. I read this book before, so I knew it was going to be more emotional going into it. Next question is a book that made you happy, and my answer for this question is a little weird because my answer is going to be Assassin's Apprentice. Not that any of the material in this book is actually happy, but I was happy because I loved this book. I had a feeling ever since I found out that this book existed that I was absolutely going to adore this book. Everything I'd heard about it sounded like it was just going to be up my alley. And so I was just so happy when I read it, and I did love it. This book, however, is not a happy book. It's very emotional, and we're following Fitz, who is the bastard son of the king in waiting. He spends the first 6 years of his life with his maternal grandfather, but when he turns 6, his maternal grandfather goes, nope, I'm done with you, drops him off at the keep, and when his father finds out that Fitz is coming to him, his father says, I'm actually gonna abdicate. So Fitz doesn't have anyone to live with. He spends the next few years being raised by the stable master before the king takes interest in him and decides to make Fitz a royal assassin. So being in Fitz's head is rough. Fitz doesn't necessarily have the easiest life. In fact, I'd say he has a hard life. So going through these emotions and the things that Fitz experiences are very hard, especially given that for most of the book, Fitz is under 13 years old. I think maybe the book ends when he's 13-ish, but he's super young for these events that are happening to him that are just horrible. I mean, he experiences almost no love and affection throughout his life. It's just like, all right, boy, your situation sucks, but what can we do? It's life, you gotta roll with it. And that just seems so horrible. So yeah, not necessarily a very happy book. Probably could have actually put this one for a book that made me cry, but I was happy that I enjoyed it. The next question is most beautiful book you've bought or received this year, and I don't have an answer. I've bought 2 books this year. None of the books are particularly pretty. I bought Game of Thrones and House of Sky and Breath, and none of those 2 are very pretty exceptionally. So, don't have an answer for this one. And the final question is, what books do you need to read before the end of the year? So one book that I really want to read before the end of the year is The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. I'm so excited to start reading N.K. Jemisin. I have a feeling I'm gonna love her works, but I obviously need to start doing that. I've been saying for the last year that I'm gonna read this book, and I haven't actually gotten around to it. So I would love if I could, I don't know, pick up the pace, actually pick this book up. That would be great. And in this book, we're following our main character who lives in kind of the outskirts of this world. One day she is summoned to the main city and is said, hey, you've been named heir to the throne, but I think she has to like fight to get that position. Yeah, she's like thrust into a vicious power struggle. So I really want to read that. Some other books I want to read are the sequel to Game of Thrones, more books in the realm of the Elderling series. Those are all series I've started, but I want to make sure that I continue on with. And then the final books that I want to get to this year are the books I'm going to have to read for AP Lit. I start AP Lit in the fall when I go back to school, so I'm going to have to read those books. Those are going to be required reading. The books I know so far that I have to read, they're my summer reading, is All the Light We Cannot See and The Great Gatsby. I know in October/November I'm going to have to read Invisible Man. I know like some of the other books that I'm going to have to read this year, but I don't know if they're going to be like in the fall or in the spring, but those are the 3 that I know I will be reading this year, so I'll also have to read those. So that was all the questions. That was the mid-year book Freakout tag. I don't know, in the comments tell me what your favorite book was you've read this year. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Down below will be links to all of the books I talked about, as well as my Goodreads and my Bookstagram if you want to follow me there. Subscribe to see more content from me, and also down below will be all of the questions if you want to do this tag yourself, and I'll see you in my next video very soon. Bye!